All right, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I hope this will be a quick video. I just wanted to put out a quick response to Mindshift, who argues that the character of the God of the Old Testament is consistently ugly, and he consistently endorses evil things. It's kind of a standard argument you might hear that Yahweh is sort of the most cruel character ever conceived in all of fiction, right? Per Richard Dawkins. Brandon, the host of Mindshift, heartily endorses this. And I wanted to address this just sort of to illustrate the hermeneutics of reading the Old Testament in this way. This is a very frequent objection. It comes up a lot. I feel like it's come up more lately. And I wanted to address it to show how one's imagination that they bring to the text can distort or aid understanding a text. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so to start, Brandon wants to argue when Christians reply that much of what happens in the Old Testament is descriptive, not prescriptive. Brandon wants to argue that no, actually a lot of it is prescriptive. And I think what he's getting at is you can tell what God values by these things and what God sort of wants by a lot of what happens. But he kind of uses really fuzzy terminology that I think is confused. So for instance, he might say, if God kills the firstborn of Egypt, then God is prescribing the death of the firstborn. But that's confused, right? God's not telling Israel to kill the firstborn. A prescription is a command issued from one person to another for the structuring of their action. God's not doing that in killing the firstborn. So I think he means that the text shows us what God endorses. And of course, since God enacts the death of the firstborn, it's true to say that God endorsed what happened in the killing of the firstborn. So I think that's what he's getting at. He's trying to say that from what God endorses, we can infer that God actually has a very ugly, atrocious character. Okay, so his first critique is about Abraham. Remember the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Hagar is the foreign slave of Sarah. Sarah harshly treats Hagar, beats her, and gives her to Abraham for the express purpose of sex and producing an offspring, because Sarah doesn't trust the promise of God. Abraham goes along with this. He has sex with Hagar, and even arguably sexually assaults. One could make that case, and I can see how Brandon gets there. For the sake of Ishmael, of producing an offspring. Now, what Brandon's argument is that God it seemed to be, because the argument was a little bit difficult to make out, but that because God didn't intervene here, therefore God must have endorsed Sarah's treatment of Hagar, because God's choice to not intervene is a choice to allow it to occur, and therefore to endorse its occurring. Now, we have to really think about what we mean by the term endorse its occurring, right? Because one can sort of allow something to occur that they don't endorse, that they don't actually have any sort of positive affection towards. In fact, that they might hate. So, for instance, suppose one, I've used this example before. Suppose a teacher gets a blast of foreknowledge for whatever, right? She knows that some student is going to cheat, little Timmy. He's going to cheat on a test, right? When she issues this test. And when he cheats, this will initiate sort of a life of wrongdoing, but what ripples out from this life of wrongdoing is the inspiration of other students to cure cancer, cure AIDS, or whatever, right? There are two things that follow from this. First, in issuing the test, she has not thereby caused Timmy to do all of those things. Right? Timmy, it's not as though Timmy could say, wow, you knew I was going to cheat and you still gave me the test. You made me do the test. Or you made me cheat. Right? My cheating was your fault. He can't actually legitimately say she made him cheat. Rather, Timmy's still responsible for his cheating. And it's also not the case that the teacher necessarily endorses Timmy's cheating. So similarly, Brandon seems to infer from God's permitting something to happen that God thereby endorses its happening, which is a false inference. It's a very strange inference to make, but I think it's one of those examples of not really reading the text charitably or sensibly, but presenting it as a sensible reading in order to sort of portray Yahweh in hyper-negative terms, I think. So another one of his objections is that God only tends to Hagar because Ishmael is the son of Abraham and not for his own sake. So God meets, arguably God, the angel of the Lord, meets Hagar when Hagar's on the point of dying from thirst, and so is Ishmael, to care for her, and blesses her and tells her Ishmael is going to be a great nation. Brandon says, well, this isn't really motivated out of true compassion for Hagar. This is only because Yahweh cares about Abraham, and Yahweh is fulfilling his promise to Abraham. This isn't about Hagar at all, except that Hagar says quite explicitly, names the place, God sees me, right? She is saying, and us as readers are to understand, that it's actually an instance of God seeing Hagar. Now, on the claim that, well, it's only for the sake of fulfilling the promise to Abraham, what Brandon seems to assume is that if God acts for a purpose, right, then that's his only purpose for acting. So, for instance, it might be true to say, and I think it is, that God tends to Hagar in order to make good on his promise to make a nation out of Ishmael. That's true. That doesn't mean that God is not tending to Hagar for her own sake. Both of those can be true, and both of those are completely compatible purposes, right? God can have multiple purposes for any singular action. Now, Brandon also makes this case that God's telling Hagar to depart, right, and telling Sarah to let Hagar depart. That's just cruel. God is separating this family. Now, it's a very strange sort of objection. He sort of says, and in this response video he did to Michael Jones, that even if, right, that my wife and child were in danger, I would never send them away, and to be told to send them away is just cruel. Now, I don't know if Brandon has read history from that comment much, right? I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but because if you think about the worst times in history, right, there have been plenty of times a father sends away his wife and child for their safety and might engage a danger. Now, what's going on here? Hagar, if you remember, is despised by Sarah at this point. She's angry with Sarah's angry, has it out for Hagar at this point. So to send Hagar out is actually an act of protection of Hagar. And it's the way God makes good on his promise to Abraham, yeah, and it's also the way God cares for Ishmael and cares for Hagar. Again, he can have multiple purposes for any individual action. So it's a rather strange objection to me. Now, Brandon might respond, well, is the only way an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God can think of, like, why couldn't he have just told Sarah? I think that was one of his arguments. Why couldn't he have just told Sarah not to do this? Now, Brandon seems to assume, and this is true throughout, I think, his videos in general, and once this assumption is undermined, I think a lot of his objections are undermined, that God can essentially make anyone do whatever he wants them to do at any time. That is to say, that God can sort of cause someone's will to move in any given direction that he sort of chooses at any time. That's not true, and we actually know this isn't true from Exodus. Now, when the people of Israel are being taken through a route, God gives instructions to Moses to lead them through a particular route so that they wouldn't turn back and go to Egypt. Now you might say, well, why doesn't God just zap the people, right? They go through a particular route, they're just zapped and so not intimidated. Well, because this is actually a violation of the will. The will actually does matter. Now, Brandon might say, well, God could have softened their hearts. But the thing is, God's interaction with the human heart is such that he actually doesn't force an action. That is to say that external forces don't cause someone to act in a particular way. They can condition someone's action, but they're not ultimately decisively responsible for what a person will do in any given circumstance. God foreknows what a person would freely do in any given circumstance, and on that basis interacts with the world. So some of my listeners might hear Molinism in that, and this is definitely influenced by Molinism. I'll address that in a different video. But this is true, right? So God knows what a human will do in any certain circumstance, and his interaction with the heart is such that he elicits free action when he elicits action towards the good. And so even God cannot force someone to act freely. He can't sort of externally determine someone's will to act in a particular way, or it's just not by definition free. So even if God told Sarah, hey, don't kill Hagar, right? God promised, think about what God promised, what Sarah heard God promise, right? Sarah heard God promise, you will have Isaac. And she says, no, I won't. And then she does this whole thing, right? With Hagar to make good on the promise. God's telling someone something does not guarantee that they'll obey it. And in fact, it might incite them to rebel. Have you ever had a parent tell you, don't stick your hand in the cookie jar, right, when you were little, and that incited something in you to just want to do it more, right? Brandon seems to have this very naive view of the human heart, of human evil, such that, well, God could just tell someone to do something and they would do it. Well, that's not always the case. That's not how the will actually works. That's not how human evil works. So Brandon again infers from God permitting what happened to Hagar and Sarah's mistreatment that God somehow endorses this. And again, it's to infer that if God permits something to happen, God endorses that which he is permitting, which Brandon has not justified remotely. And we're going to see that there's actually explicit reason to think this is false. Now, in Genesis 12, Abraham was not punished for lying. Rather, the Pharaoh's household was punished. And they were punished on account of having Sarah, and they experienced plagues and such. Now, why would God do that? Why would God punish Pharaoh's household for something they just didn't know, right? They're just innocent bystanders. They were just helplessly deceived by Abraham, and God's whacking them for their helpless state. Again, the imagination you bring to these texts makes a massive difference in how you read these texts. Suppose, as we know from history, that Pharaoh was intent on cultivating a harem, and his household was intent on actually building a harem. God's judgment of Pharaoh's household in their attempt to take a woman that belongs to someone else is an indictment of the whole family, right? So yes, God enacts justice at the point at which they take Abraham's wife. He enacts an indictment against the family at the point at which Abraham's wife is taken. But that doesn't mean he's condemning them as sort of helpless, innocent bystanders, and they just didn't know any better. The whole reason they're taking women to begin with is to cultivate a harem. Like that's the whole point. And so God, in sending a plague on Pharaoh's household, is indicting the whole sort of corporate system that would lead to this. This is why corporate punishment is a thing in the Hebrew Bible. And we often think of corporate punishment because we think in very individualistic terms, right? except as of recently with the discussions of systemic racism and such. I think we're sort of regaining a consciousness of this. But it used to be the case, at least, that we're pretty individualistic, and for whatever reason, we're really individualistic whenever we read the Bible. And so when we hear corporate punishment, we think one person is sort of being vicariously punished for another. That's not what happens in corporate punishment cases. Rather, in corporate punishment, you have an organism that's considered a kind of organic whole, right? So if you imagine a harmony of 3 notes, you don't just sort of pluck one note after the other. You play them together, and the harmony is sort of the interaction of the whole. Corporate punishment is an indictment of the total system that's interacting to produce a given sin. So that's what's happening here, that when Sarah is taken, God is acting to judge the whole system that just takes women in order to have them as part of their harem. Pharaoh sleeping with a bunch of women, right, is condemnable because he takes a woman that belongs to another person, that belongs to Abraham, and he doesn't really even care initially until he's cursed, right? Until he knows Abraham's a man of God, and so Abraham would bring curses upon him. So Pharaoh only cares when he's being cursed. But up until that point, he's just sort of taking women, right, to put them in his harem. So this is a problem. So this is an indictment on that whole sort of corrupt system. Okay, Jacob. Now, Brandon argues that God blesses Jacob's deception, right? So Jacob is chosen to be the one through whom the promise of God will move through Jacob to the world. And so when Jacob wins the birthright, then God, in sort of fulfilling his promise through Jacob's deception, is just endorsing Jacob's deception. That's prescriptive, he says. And again, it stems from this assumption that if God permits something to occur, God endorses that which he permits. Or if God uses even a given action of a person, then he endorses that action. Here's why we know that's false. And we're going to address Joseph later. But remember, in the narrative of Joseph, and interestingly, Brandon never brings this up, even though he's heard this many times, and I know he's heard this many times. In the narrative, God, in Genesis 50 through 20, Joseph tells us, when he's speaking to the brothers, that what you meant for evil, God meant for good. So, God's sovereignty and providence is such that God can intend something different than what human actors intend in their actions. God permits Joseph to be sold into slavery. That doesn't mean God endorses the injustice of slavery. Rather, as we're told by Joseph, what Joseph's brothers meant for evil, God meant for good. God's intent in permitting that is to bring about the salvation of a people, and to bring about actually, and we'll again address this, preservation through a famine. Now, is election of Jacob, God's choosing Jacob over Esau, just unjust favoritism? No. Or is it an endorsement of Jacob's character as a deceiver? It's a very strange kind of objection, but no, it's not. And in fact, when in Deuteronomy, God picks Israel, we're explicitly told that it has nothing to do with Israel being more virtuous, more great than all the nations. We're told that consistently in the New Testament, that election has nothing to do with the virtue of the person elected. Okay, so why does God choose one and not the other? Well, what we have to start with is the fact that no one deserves election. No one deserves to be chosen by God and designated for any purpose. No one deserves that. We all deserve divine judgment. And so one can't begrudge a judge. One can't say that a judge owes them a pardon. If a judge chooses mercy, then it's mercy precisely because a judge doesn't owe that to the judged criminal. And similarly, in the mercy of election, one cannot say that that is somehow unjust, or that the person not elected should have also been elected, as though they somehow had a right to mercy or a right to pardon. Election is an act of mercy, and therefore no one is entitled to it. So no one can condemn God for not receiving the grace of election. Now, Jacob, of course, but we're also, again, importantly, it's not the case that election means the person elected is better in any way or is somehow endorsed by God in any way. So when God uses Jacob's deceit to bring about Jacob's election, the fulfillment of the promise, that's not an endorsement of deceit, and we can infer that because we're told again in Genesis that God can use evil, which in Genesis 50:20, remember, this is the climax of the book of Genesis. So this is what we're supposed to sort of take away as we come to the end of the book, that what people mean for evil, God means for good, and that God's intentions are not identical or an endorsement ever of people's intentions in any particular action. That's the lesson you're supposed to learn. So when Jacob marries Leah and Rachel, and God uses that to bring about the tribes of Israel, you're not supposed to infer that that's thereby an endorsement of polygamy. Again, because we're told that in the climax of Genesis as a summary of God's providence, that what people mean for evil, God can mean for good, and therefore has a different intention often in the actions that people enact. Now, Brandon argues, well, an omnipotent God should have condemned it earlier instead of working through the wrong of polygamy. But again, this assumes so much about the human heart that, again, it strikes me as incredibly naive. If you think about the complexities of the human heart, when people are often told in certain stages, don't do X, that often incites them to do X. So if God knows what free agents would do at any given time, then he's not going to give certain commands that would incite evil at certain times. In Matthew 19, for instance, we're told that God's ideal matches the creation ideal for sexuality. So Jesus bases the condemnation of divorce on the picture of Genesis. One man, one woman in marriage for life. And we're told that God gave the statute for divorce as a concession to people's hardness of heart. So for whatever reason, they weren't ready to actually hear don't divorce. That would have incited something. It would have increased the kind of evil, the overall evil of the world. So sometimes God gives his commands in stages in order to work his plan to renew and redeem all of creation. Now, Brandon's argument and his beef with Joseph is that Joseph, during the famine, if you remember, he receives the gift of interpretation, so he's able to interpret prophetic dreams, and he knows of a famine ahead of time. Brandon's reading would have it that Joseph essentially had Pharaoh steal the food of the people, put it in a storehouse, and then sell it back to them at a price. Now, that's just it's not at all what happened, right? So if you read the text, what happens is Joseph, he does take a fifth of the people's food, and he stores it. Now, why would he do that? Well, if you're hungry during a famine, what do? The tendency is often to burn through your food and eat much more than you need to eat. That's often what happens in starvation situations when there's a bunch of food, you might just eat it all. So Joseph saves enough that's going to last them through the famine. Now, Brandon's beef with this is, well, Joseph has them buy it back. Now, think about the concept of taxation, right? In the concept of taxation, the government takes money, and for certain services, we still have to pay the government, right? So the government takes tax money and builds roads, but then I drive and they charge me a toll, right? Now, one might say, well, that's unjust, but that's the way our political order is sort of set up. And it's disputable whether that's just or unjust or not. What Joseph does is he stores food up, and yeah, he sells it back to the people, but that fits with the general common conception of taxation, of a government's right to tax its people. Now, again, you might say, well, an omnipotent God shouldn't have to stoop down to taxation. But then remember, God's purpose is to renew the heart of the human race, right? So his purpose is to bring the human race to a particular point, which means that God's going to work within the structures of society that already exist in order to do that, rather than just blowing those structures up, because that doesn't bring a person to freely change. It doesn't bring the human race to freely improve their moral consciousness. Now, interestingly, the people, at least according to Genesis, have a much different response than Brandon would have you believe. They say to Joseph, "You saved our lives." Now, why would they say that? Now, of course, Brandon could say, well, that's just propaganda, but again, that would be begging the question. It would be to assume the text is wrong and then to use your assumption that the text is wrong to thereby show that the text is wrong. Why would they say that? Well, again, remember in Genesis 12, contra Brandon, and he goes back to this point quite a bit, that why should an omnipotent God even have a chosen people which he favors above everyone else? In Genesis 12, God elects Abraham for what? That his family would be a blessing to the nations. So the family is not just taken out and designated for their own sake. They're rather chosen to be a blessing, a channel of blessing to the nations. And so in Genesis 49 and Genesis 50, what you're supposed to see is that's starting to happen. Joseph functions as a blessing to the Egyptians by preserving them through famine. That's what's going on here. And that's why the people say, you saved our lives. Right? Through Joseph's administration, the promise given to Abraham that they would be a blessing to the nations is starting to come true. So yeah, they're elected, but they're elected for blessing to the world, for blessing to the nations. Okay, now Brandon has quite a few grips with Moses. For instance, Moses kills the taskmaster. That's beating a Hebrew slave, and Brandon's claim is that God endorses this because God doesn't stop it. Again, it's that assumption that if God permits something to happen, God thereby in permitting it is endorsing what he permits, and we've seen from Genesis you're supposed to know that that's not the case. Now, how does God harden hearts, right? So Pharaoh, Brandon argues, is just sort of unwittingly made to do evil. God just kind of causes Pharaoh to do evil, and that's what it means for God to harden a heart. Except it's just not what it means at all for God to harden a heart. And we're told by Jewish readers of the Hebrew Scriptures what it means, right? Paul in Romans 1 talks about God giving us over. So when God hardens the heart of any person, he's not infusing new evil into them. Rather, he's just giving them over to their own choices. And Calvin actually has a very good image for this as well. When God hardens a heart, he gives people over, and so one might say, well, that's just shying away from the active language of it. And God actually can bring about evil in some cases through grace, actually. And that's actually the occasioning, not the causing of evil. Now, what's the difference between those two things? Well, suppose I don't know, I tell someone that I'm really happy to see them, and for whatever reason, they're hearing someone else is happy to see me, right? Thereby, sort of brings up memories of their dad or whatever. I don't know, some trauma. My words there, or me, I'm not the cause of that. I might be the occasion. And that's actually a very standard distinction in philosophy between causing something and occasioning something. When God hardens the heart, he can do so through grace. So for instance, if someone said, we're actually told this in Romans 7, when the law is given and it says don't steal, the way that occasions sin is analogous to when you're little and you hear your parents say don't touch this and you go ahead and touch it, right? The law comes into this context of the human heart and then elicits our own sinfulness because of what we do. So when God hardens the heart, he draws out what's actually already there through grace. So for instance, Moses might say to Pharaoh, what you're doing is unjust, let my people go. That's actually a grace. To tell a tyrant to stop doing tyranny is a grace to them. It's not evil for God to move Moses to do that, and yet in response to that, Pharaoh can then harden his heart. So in response to God's direct action, God knows that that will occasion rebellion, and thereby he draws out evil that's already there without infusing any new evil into the heart. So he doesn't make Pharaoh act. He doesn't cause Pharaoh to do something as though Pharaoh is externally determined. He rather creates a context of grace, actually, in which Pharaoh chooses then to respond, and God knows Pharaoh would respond in a particular way. It's kind of like setting up actually a sting operation, right? If you set up a sting, or let's say a police force sets up a sting where they send someone to the bank, right? Or they send out a person who they know is sort of a high priority target or whatever, but they send out that person to do what they love and to like feed poor people or whatever. And they send them out in the streets of Chicago to do this. And these people, seeing this charitable giver, who maybe the FBI they're targeting, then come out to sort of clamp down on this guy, this charitable giver, right? The FBI didn't cause those people to come out and then clamp down on that charitable giver. They created the occasion in which that happened. And that's often what God does when he draws out people's evil. He's not infusing any new evil into their hearts. So he both gives them over and then in judgment will create an occasion to draw it out and make it more evident. Now, was Moses, he says killing the firstborn was prescriptive, not descriptive. But of course, again, that's an issue, an area of category confusion, because Moses was not commanded to kill the firstborn. God killed the firstborn. Now, Brendan says, well, this is just disgusting. This is gross. Like, if God kills a baby, that's horrible. God is the fundamental giver of all life. All life is his. So what differentiates God from humanity and gives God the moral right to take life is that it's his. If Yahweh is the foundation of all reality, which is what Christians claim, then all rights originate from his being. And so they're actually conditioned and determined by God's own being. Now, that's not to say that God sort of just willy-nilly like takes human life whenever, but it is to say that when God takes a human life, he's exercising a right that he has. And when he does so, he does it always in accordance with the aim to fight the evil of his world. So for instance, he might take a child back to be with himself. If a child is innocent of wrongdoing, or a firstborn person rather is innocent of wrongdoing, God takes that spirit back to himself to be with him. And then that child awaits the final resurrection, where they will get their life back, they will get their body back, and will share it eternally in the presence of God. And God has removed them from a context in which that might not have happened. So he has absolute rights over life, and when he exercises his right to give and take life as he wills, he always does it in accordance with his overall goal to fight evil and to renew creation. Now, did God command rape in Numbers 31? Okay, so, the killing of the Midianites, Moses and Israel are to kill the men, women, and the boys, and to keep any young woman or any young girl who has not slept with a man. And Brandon just says, well, so for themselves, and that obviously implies sex. It's just not what the text says, though. So the text just says that there's to keep alive the young girls for themselves. In truth, because these are not these are virgins, they're probably very, very young girls, which means they would have been integrated into Israelite society, not kept as sex slaves, but rather integrated into Israelite family, learning the ways of Yahweh. And if, again, because Brandon's trying to do this as an internal critique, he's trying to say the Bible's depiction of God is a depiction of a God who's cruel and ugly. If it's true that other false gods are demonic, then when God integrates these children into a new context, he's actually removing them from a context of demonic corruption, of sin, of other things that might turn their hearts inward and corrupt their humanity. So again, it's not to read this notion that they kept the Midianite girls as sex slaves, is to read something in that the text just doesn't say. And this is an instance of bringing a kind of imagination, an imagination that's pretty sexualized to the text, and then interpreting the text in the context of that imagination. So he continues, he argues, okay, well, the Levite purge. So if you remember, the Levites, they are the people of Israel, worshipped the golden calf. Moses, in response, tells the Levites, strap a sword, clean house, cut down people. And Brandon's argument is that the people of Israel, they didn't have any choice to worship Yahweh. So they were just doing what their culture was doing and worshiping false gods. And again, this is a bizarre argument. This should cue his listeners that this is not a really honest engagement with the text. The people of Israel did this after they had just seen the works of Yahweh, after they had just come through the Red Sea. So to say, well, they had no choice, they were just doing what their culture was doing, is completely disingenuous to what the actual text depicts. They had, for a long time, ever since Abraham had known Yahweh, had worshipped Yahweh, and they had just been rescued by Yahweh. And so to turn on him at that point, to commit an act of idolatry at that point, is to reject the foundation of all reality, the foundation of all beauty, goodness, and value, and to say the foundation of beauty and goodness and value is not worth it. And that's really serious. Now, Brandon might say, well, idolatry, like why would anyone be killed over that, right? So the extent to which something is wrong, in part, is determined by the dignity of the one wronged. So, for instance, if I accidentally step on a cicada, there are a bunch of cicadas in the Midwest right now. If I accidentally step on a cicada, that might be bad. That's not nearly as bad as being negligent or negligently killing a human being. Why? Because a human being has higher dignity, higher value. So to reject God has incredibly high implications. It's a wrong of much greater severity than just sinning against a person or human, rather. It's to sin against the infinite foundation of all dignity and value at all. Now, Brandon then argues that Moses and God through Moses commanded the Canaanite slaughter for the sake of racial purity, except that in the text Brandon quotes about this, it's very explicitly about not taking on the practices that the Canaanite nations do. it's very explicitly about resisting their idolatry, their child sacrifice, their murder, their perversions. In Leviticus 18, there's a whole series of perversions that are addressed, for which God is judging the Canaanites. So again, Brandon seems to be badly misreading the text here. Okay, so of course then Brandon brings up Joshua and the killing of children. Now, the killing of children, I think, is a harder one because it's not God doing it. He's having people do it. So it's harder. And I do think there's wrestling there. Now, again, the first points I've mentioned before apply equally here. That God has absolute rights over people. And when God enacts this, when he takes a child's life, he's taking them back to his own presence. Now, Brandon portrays this as though Joshua is just sort of killing an innocent culture, and he sort of says, well, there must have been some innocent people. There must have been people who were just caught in the crossfires, right? But that's not what the text says. And so if he's going to critique the God the text portrays, he can't just say, well, yeah, there must have been innocent people, and so God was commanding the killing of innocents. Rather, the text is portraying a viscerally corrupt culture into which kids are born. And if you know child psychology, if you've looked into some of the literature, it is possible for a child to actually be damaged in substantive ways, given a certain cultural context in which they find themselves. And so when God removes a child from that context back to his own presence, he keeps their spirit with himself until, again, the final resurrection, at which point God raises them from the dead and they enjoy his presence forever, right? Now, the hardest part about this, to my mind anyway, is that the people of Israel are commanded to do it. Now, why is this the case? Well, God designates instruments of his actions at certain times and in certain places. So, for instance, we're told in Romans 13 that God's designated judges, magistrates of given nations, of all nations, to enact justice against the evildoer. They're appointed to that role. So in this case, Israel in a particular time, in a particular place, is appointed to the role of cleansing the land to make space for God's redemptive plan to go forth. And they're appointed to be the instrument in which God takes back the child to himself. Again, God has a right to do that. As the author of the rights of humanity, he has a right to do that. Now, contra Brandon's perspective, his worldview, doesn't actually have a foundation to ground morality. Now, one might, of course, misinterpret this claim as saying, well, if you're an atheist, you just don't believe right and wrong, which is obviously not what I'm saying. Rather, on atheism, there's no objective foundation by which you can say one person's standard of good is more right or more wrong than another. Human flourishing, quote unquote, materially defined, does not cut it. That's just a form of utilitarianism, right? If you calculate, for instance, it'll bring more flourishing than not to kill the elderly, right, in a given society, it's still immoral to kill the elderly. So that doesn't serve as a foundation for objective ethics. Now, he argues little girls become sex slaves. We've addressed that. That's not the case. They're integrated into Israelite society. Okay, David. Now, he argues that David's non-repentance from polygamy means that God condones polygamy. And again, hardness of heart example, right? God does not condemn divorce at the time, owing to people's hardness of heart and what they're ready to hear and what they're ready for. God killing David's child, that's unjust. Well, again, God takes the child's spirit back to himself, and the child awaits the final resurrection of the dead. And so, no, he doesn't do the child a wrong, and as the author of the rights of life, he has rights over life. As the creator of life, the origin of all rights at all, the ground of all being, and therefore his being determines and conditions the rights of any other thing. He has rights, therefore, to take the child back to himself. He's in a unique place because of his ontologically unique place as the foundation of all reality. Now, Brandon argues that God has David's wives raped. That's just not true. It's just, if you read the text, it's that the kings sleep with David's wives in open daylight. They have sex. There's no mention of rape, and there's specific language for rape in the Bible, and that's just not there. They're not said to be violated or anything like that. So that was it's a very odd reading. David kills the Philistines and he brings their foreskins. Isn't that gross? Well, again, David is serving, and this is an instance of a magistrate, right? David's appointed as a magistrate to enact God's justice. And the imagination, again, that you bring to these texts makes a huge difference. If you think the Philistines are just kind of normal people, like they're just kind of your happy-go-lucky suburban group of people, like Brandon might live in, or like I live in, or whatever, right? Then yeah, that's going to be troubling to you. But recall what I've said before. In The Lord of the Rings, when Legolas is sort of on the elephant, shooting arrows at the men of the East, no one's saying, "Oh, like how terrible this is," right? No one's saying this sucks. Like, "Oh my gosh, Legolas is committing genocide." No, like Legolas is fighting the enemy because the enemy, the men of the East, have capitulated to evil and thereby become like the orcs. Philistines, this wasn't a nice culture. These weren't nice people. This was an incredibly depraved culture. And so David's enacting God's judgment. Now, remember what we've said before. God's intention in any given action cannot be read off of the actor's intention, as we've learned in Genesis. Because what people can mean for evil, God can mean for good. And thereby we learn from that text that God can have different intentions that human actors have in any given action. Okay, Elijah, slaughtering of the prophets of Baal, isn't that murder? No, so here God does condone Elijah's action, right? He's the one who sends fire down. I think it's reasonable to read the text this way. Elijah slaughters the prophets of Baal, again enacting God's judgment here. God has the right to judge people. And the prophets of Baal, remember that this is what we don't get in our modern world, is that worship in the ancient world forms you. And if you take religion seriously, this is how it used to work, right? We often think of religion as this private individual thing. Religion in the ancient world, and often today in many places, if you take your faith seriously, forms all of life. And so to worship the prophets of Baal is not just an issue of getting a deity wrong, right? They're cutting themselves. There are often certain practices, occultic practices, that come with this. There are invocations of demonic agents that come with this. So the prophets of Baal, again, are not nice people, right? No one, recall Legolas, no one says Legolas is committing a genocide when he's shooting the men of the East with his arrows. This is not what happens. Similarly, God is dealing and judging evil in his world in this text. Elisha, she-bears, that's been dealt with many, many times. Now, importantly, these aren't actually necessarily like little 6-year-old kids. These are probably teenagers. And what it means to insult a prophet in that time, and it is to insult God. That's how it would have been understood. It's understood as this rejection of Yahweh. And so if you think that's a serious wrong, then the she-bears are an execution and a visible demonstration of the extent to which it's wrong. Namely, that God gives them over to the chaos of nature, to the chaos of animals, and lets those animals maul them. Now, what's happening there, again, is not that these are like innocent little youths just like playing basketball in a driveway. Right? Like if they're willing to do this at this time, that means they're imitating the culture around them and they're likely engaging in some of these occultic practices themselves. I don't know if any of you watch the true crime podcasts, but it's kind of harrowing what teenagers are capable of. And there are times where you might hear a story and you think to yourself, you know what, like that teenager deserved life in prison. What they're doing here is they're rejecting God, they're rejecting Yahweh, and endorsing sort of the culture around them that's filled with these practices. And that's to say Yahweh is less valuable, less worth following than these demonic agents. That's to insult the living God. And if the dignity of the offended has bearing on the severity of the wrong, then the wrong is great in proportion to the dignity of the offended. Sometimes these things seem cruel to us because we actually don't take God seriously. So we actually don't think he's as valuable as he actually is. Okay, Samson, similar, killing the Philistines, that's cruel. Isn't God's motives identical to Samson's motives? So, God, for instance, empowers Samson to kill 30 Philistines. Again, God's actions and his motives, we're supposed to have learned this, are not always identical to the motives of any given agent, where God is enacting his judgment against evildoers, right? People who have sided with the proverbial orcs, the proverbial men of the East. That's not always an endorsement of Samson's motives. Now, Samson prays, God, let me avenge myself, right, for my eyes. And God answers that prayer. What we have to understand about just and unjust vengeance or justice or judgment. Sometimes these words are used together and they're used interchangeably, and so there's a concept that's being gotten at in the condemnation of something like vengeance, right? Vengeance is mine, thus says the Lord, in Romans and elsewhere. Vengeance, the unjust kind, is to seize and to enact justice where you haven't been given the proper authority to, and you're not doing it in proportion. But there's also a kind of justice that's proportionate where you've been given the authority to do so. God is ultimately the one who appoints the authorities of the world to deal his justice, right? We think of reality as God's acting and then humans acting. God's agencies up here, human agencies here, and never the twain shall meet. God actively sometimes exercises his agency through human agency. And so in the cases of justice and the deliverance of justice, we're told in Romans that God actually executes his act of justice through human agents. So God's agency and human agency are intertwined such that divine agency, when humans do the good, does not overrule that agency, but empowers and brings that about. Now, God does not bring about evil. He's not the cause of evil, 1 John, right? There's no darkness in him at all, and therefore those who follow God are children of light. So he's not the source of darkness or evil in the human heart, but he is the source of good in such a way that when a human person does good, God is acting to do good as well. He's moving them to do good, but to do it freely, such that you can genuinely say it's theirs as well. That the human person wasn't externally, you can still commend them because their agency wasn't overrun by God's agency. But God's goodness moved them towards goodness. Now, that means then that God executes his justice over and against the Philistines in this situation. And so Samson serves as God's instrument of divine wrath. Okay, Jephthah, finally. Brandon says that, well, to Christians who say descriptive rather than prescriptive, Yahweh doesn't stop Jephthah, so God helps Jephthah, when Jephthah makes the vow, God empowers Jephthah to fulfill the conditions of the vow, so he must be accepting Jephthah's sacrifice. Again, you're supposed to read this text in light of having read what came before, and in Leviticus 5, there's provision for a rash vow. Jephthah could have made use of the provision for the rash vow that Leviticus 5 explicitly sets out. So that Jephthah goes ahead and sacrifices his daughter is just not an endorsement, especially in light of the fact that we're told there's provision for reneging on your vows when you've realized it's rash. Jephthah could have done this. And remember, in the book of Judges, we're given this picture of a society that's spiraling down, such that by the end of the book, right, everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Judges is a picture of compromised judges, compromised deliverers in a society, in the covenant people, that are spiraling into depravity. So this is supposed to contribute to that picture. Brandon seems to misread these texts. I don't know where it comes from, but he seems to bring this almost like deep anger, it seems like, and he might claim otherwise, I could be wrong about it, to reading these texts, such that he reads them with this almost jaundiced eye, and in the worst possible light. But if you actually approach these texts for what they say, you're trying to ascertain the picture of God that they actually teach. It's a very different story, I think we've shown, than what Brandon would have you believe. And that speaks to the importance and the effect that the imagination that you bring into the text can significantly influence how a text impacts you. If you hear the statement, God killed a city, one can imagine just like the city of Chicago with like your average everyday person, and that text, and then fill in the details of that sentence with that imaginative frame. Or you can imagine Legolas attacking a city of the men of the East, right? And fill in the details of that sentence with that imaginative frame. Since it's a high context society, you're expected to have a properly formed imaginative frame when you're reading these texts. I hope this video can help contribute to that end. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful to you. Let me know what you think. Please feel free to push back. If you're new to my channel, go ahead and like and subscribe, and God bless.